the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages would be the period between 1066 and 1485, between the time when King William I becomes the ruler of England, and in 1485 when Henry Richmond defeats Richard III in the battle at Bosworth Field and takes over the rule of England as King Henry VII, marking the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. We'll look at the main kings during the Middle Ages. We'll begin with William I. We'll also cover the main events that happened in these years, in these centuries, very quickly. William I was the first Norman king. He was the Duke of the province called Normandy. He thought he had a right to the English crown, and soon after Harold became the King of England, he came over to England, fought, defeated Harold, and he became the king. The events leading to the Norman invasion and the invasion itself are depicted in a very interesting 70-meter long cloth, which is today called the Bayeux Tapestry, which is preserved in a museum in Normandy even today. And this tapestry, which has embroidered on it the events leading to the Norman invasion and also the invasion itself. Here it's an extract from the tapestry where you can see William the Conqueror in the middle. Well, he ruled until 1087. So, what are the main things that we should remember as literature students about William I? He commissioned what is called the Domesday Book. The Domesday Book was a book containing an elaborate survey of the English resources, all the resources in England, including land, including livestock, even the number of chicken a person had. So it was an elaborate survey. It's a very important historic document, which is for reference, is available for reference even today. It's available online on opendoomsday.org. You can look at it page by page. So it's a very important resource, historical document, which he ordered, and it was completed in 1086. The idea was to tax the country as much as possible based on the information he got from the Domesday Book. The word doomsday was not originally used with the book, but it came in later. Doomsday, the word doom doesn't have the present day meaning of total destruction. It means judgment. Doomsday is judgment day. And the connotation is that the material in the book is as unchangeable as the last judgment. And it was during the William I, he was paranoid about his position in England because he always knew he was a foreigner. Interestingly, the time he marched into England after being victorious to take over the crown, the people of England welcomed him. They cheered him. But he and his people did not understand that, and he, went on, and his people went on and burned down the city of London at that time. So there was always this misunderstanding between the Norman, French dialect-speaking Normans and the English people, and we can imagine the confusion, at least in the initial decades of the Norman rule. So the Anglo-Saxon period comes to an end, and a new regime comes in, and the paranoid king who is constantly afraid of his safety and his security, orders the building of a very secure fort. He had many forts built across England, and this fort, which is called the Tower of London, the White Tower, this part, was commissioned by him, and the construction began under him. And today, the what is called the Tower of London is a complex of many fortified buildings. Here you have a more clear picture. You can see this is the tower complex. You have the White Tower here and other buildings, and there's a huge wall and a moat outside. And it was over time, it was a royal residence, it was a zoo for some time, it was a treasury for some time, it was a prison. Many very famous prisoners were there, and you can still see the torture weapons and the place where many people were beheaded, including the wives of Henry VIII. And it's of particular interest that the crown jewels are kept inside the tower today. It's one of the most secure places in the whole world. And the jewel, which is famous as Kohinoor diamond, is also today preserved inside this tower complex. So this is the tower complex. And I just, out of curiosity, there is the tower bridge we can see just across. So a person can travel down the Thames River, get down here in the boat, and visit the Tower of London today. And this is the Tower Bridge, which is famous for the ability to rise up and allow ships to pass. Many people believe that this is the London Bridge. This is not the London Bridge. London Bridge is a little distance away, which is a very ordinary looking, unassuming looking bridge. The bridge that T.S. Eliot talks about. The crowd flowed over London Bridge, and the bridge in the nursery rhyme, London Bridge is falling down. It is not this bridge. Many would believe that this is a very spectacular bridge, but this is called the Tower Bridge. So, well, the construction of the White Tower began during William the First. And the impact of Norman takeover was that systematically the whole Anglo-Saxon nobility and clergy were replaced by the French people. Many English noblemen were killed. Many became subservient to the rulers. The new ruling class became French. And French became the Norman version of French. The Norman dialect became the official language of England. English lost its privilege and its prestige as the language. The prestige it gained during Alfred the Great was totally lost. And it was also the beginning of vast changes that was to take place in English. The present discrepancy in English spelling, all kinds of absurdities that we often ascribe to English language, began with the coming in of the Norman uh, conventions into English language, both in terms of borrowing of words, borrowing of grammatical features, borrowing of syntactic features, and also French people writing down English and bringing in French spelling conventions. Another king that we need to remember is Henry II, who came some generations after William the First. And it was during Henry the First, who ruled from 1154 to 1189, that the momentous event of the murder of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, took place. Thomas Becket was a close friend of Henry, and who Henry made the Archbishop of Canterbury, hoping that he would be his close ally so that he could control the church as well. But once Thomas became the Archbishop, he stopped being the king's friend and he was very independent. And finally, the king wished aloud that if only somebody got rid of this old priest, and this not old priest is, troublesome priest, and four of his knights secretly went and murdered Thomas Becket inside the Canterbury Cathedral. You can see another monk behind, and you can see four knights. It's the story is that soon after the murder, the four knights ran away and hid in a castle in a place called Knaresborough in Northumberland. Well, that was the martyrdom of Thomas Becket, which happened in 1170, and the today we can see this monument in the Canterbury Cathedral, the spot where the assassination took place, and Thomas is written here, and this is a sculpture in memory of the murder. And the murder in the cathedral has triggered so many works of art, including literary works. The Canterbury Tales, Tennyson's Becket, Murder in the Cathedral, T.S. Eliot are only examples of the event. Well, this is an event that is important in terms of English literature. And the story is that King Henry II went on to atone for the murder of the Archbishop. He had himself flogged in public, and he did penance and narrowly escaped the wrath of the people and the Pope. He continued to rule for several years more. That was a very diplomatic step on Henry II's part. Um, Another ruler, who actually Henry II had a few sons, and of which Richard was the I think, third son. But by the time Henry died, he was the only eldest son remaining, and he became the King of England. And Richard the First is known in history as Richard the Lionheart. He was a a man, a very valiant person, of course, very brave and very strong. But he was filled with romantic notions about gallantry, and he was more interested in romantic battles rather than ruling the country. And soon after becoming the ruler of England, he went left on a crusade. It's the third crusade, and crusades are, I would say, very foolish battles that Christians fought in the Middle East to secure the Christian holy places. And Richard the First fought Saladin, the Middle East ruler, and he did not actually win much, and that is a very interesting story of immense foolishness that people sometimes undertake. But in English literature, in history, he is almost a legendary person, and he occurs as the Dark Knight, the Black Knight in the Robin Hood stories. He occurs in as a very heroic and mysterious figure who comes in the last minute when an urgent need is there in Scott's Ivanhoe and Talisman. Well, that is Richard the First, and Richard the First, when he was away, his youngest brother John was teasingly called John Lackland because he was not supposed to inherit any of his father's property. But John was kind of taking care of matters at home when Richard the First was away. But finally, Richard the First um, got killed in Europe during one of his adventures. He went in disguise and did many foolish things like that. Even though, from another perspective, they are very gallant things. Well, he was killed in Europe. And interestingly, his body is buried in three places. His heart is buried in one part of France. His entrails are buried in another part of France, the place where he was killed. And also, the rest of the body is buried in yet another part of France. His life itself is a very interesting story. That is Richard the First, though not known as a great king. He is almost a legend. He is called Richard the Lionheart. His brother John Lackland did not lack land totally because once Richard II first died, he became the ruler of England. He was one of the most unpopular kings in England, and you can see him with a very demure face here signing the Magna Carta. He was forced to sign this document by the barons who wanted to have some kind of democracy. Well, democracy wouldn't be the right term. It's not the people, but the barons having some authority over the king, or the king being limited by the authority of the barons. And this is the famous document called Magna Carta, and you have the royal seal attached to it. There are two copies of this preserved in the British Library in London today, and there are two other. We do not know exactly how many copies were originally made, and of which four are still said to be existing. Two in England, in the British Library in London. Well, that is King John Magna Carta. It was signed in 1215. It's a very important document, and historically, and in the history of democracy. And in England also, this Magna Carta became a document which was renewed. The clauses in which was renewed by later kings as well. Um, well, there are also a few other kings we should remember of the Middle Ages who are very important from a literary point of view. One is Edward II, who came after um, John and others, who is famous for his love for his friend Gaveston, and he is the hero in, or rather, the protagonist in Christopher Marlowe's play. And Edward III is another very significant monarch. During his reign, Chaucer was born, and he was followed by his grandson Richard II. Richard II was the son of the Black Prince, Edward the Black Prince, the son of Edward III. Edward III's son, Black Prince, was a big hope of the people, but he died before his father died. So when Edward III died, Richard II became the ruler. He was more a dramatic kind of person and not an efficient king. And the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 happened during Richard II's reign. And Richard II is one of Shakespeare's history plays. So are Henry the Fourth, who came after. Henry the Fourth is actually Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's cousin, who had Richard imprisoned and he became king. Richard was later killed in prison. Richard the Fourth, Shakespeare has written two parts. Henry the Fourth. Shakespeare has two plays, Henry the Fourth, Part One and Part Two, and we know of a Prince Hall in these plays. And Prince Hall comes in first, and a reference to him happens in Richard II. We hear a lot about him during Henry the Fourth, and we find Prince Hall becoming Henry the Fifth in the play Henry the Fifth, the famous hero of the Battle of Agincourt. Again, another Shakespeare's play is based on his life. Henry V died young, to be followed by his young son Henry VI, who later proved to be a very infirm person. But he ruled for quite a long time. But he was a very unreliable and very weak king. During his reign, we saw the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses. Immense lot of problems began to brew in England, and there was a lot of unrest in that time. There was going on with France as well. Joan of Arc was a person in that time. She appears in one of Henry the Sixth plays of Shakespeare. There are three of them. Henry the Sixth Shakespeare plays. Three parts are there. And from the confusion of the Wars of the Roses, there were many kings went and came and went. Many Edwards came. Another Henry came, and um, uh, Henry didn't come. This is Henry the Sixth, and we had a few Edwards coming in, children, grandchildren of Henry, who were a few of them were ousted, a few of them were killed, and finally we see the emergence of Richard the Third. He is Richard, the Earl of Gloucester, who is remembered in history as Richard Crookback. He had a lot of villainy ascribed to him. And interestingly, in 2015, his body was discovered in Chester, in England, and he was reburied in a church there. Well, Richard III, and he was not in the line to be a king, but he grabbed the crown of England, but couldn't rule for long. He ruled maybe for a year or so when, again, there was a lot of unrest in the country. And this Wars of the Roses was a battle within the king, within the families of the Lancaster and York, and each having a rose as their symbol, a red rose and a white rose. And it went on for quite a long time. And finally, as the perhaps the final battlefield would be the Battle of Bosworth or Bosworth Field, where in 1485 Richard III, who had a big crook back condition on his back, it's a condition called scoliosis, where he could not walk steadily. So he was a big fighter on horseback, and we have the famous scene in Shakespeare where Richard III falls from the horse and he screams, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." But nobody gave him a horse. Instead, people cut him down and he was killed. And somebody shouts that the bloody dog is dead. And that is the gruesome end of Richard III, and that is also the end of the Middle Ages in England in a symbolic manner, because after Richard III is killed, in the battlefield itself, we find that the crown is taken from, he goes to the battle with wearing the crown, and the crown is taken from the bushes, and it is placed on the head of Henry Richmond, the young leader who was fighting against Richard III. Henry Richmond unites the two houses, the house of Lancaster and York, and he crowns himself, or the people elect him as the next ruler of England. So Henry becomes ruler of England as Henry the Seventh, and he is the first of the Tudor monarchs. So, for the sake of convenience, we say that around this time, maybe in around 1500, when Henry the Seventh had ruled for a comfortable period of time, we would say that the Middle Age ends and uh, uh, the beginning of modern age dawns. So we will look at that in another video. Thank you for listening.